My name is not important. What is important is that for the first 27 years of my life, I believed, truly, deeply, with everything I had, that I was the problem. I believed I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too ungrateful, too much. I believed that the reason my family treated me the way they did was that something inside me was fundamentally broken, and they were responding to that brokenness in the only way they knew how. I was wrong. I know that now. But knowing it now doesn't erase the years I spent apologizing for existing. This is the story of how I found out I was wrong, what I did about it, and what happened when the family that spent nearly 3 decades using me as their emotional punching bag, their unpaid servant, their scapegoat, and their dirty little secret finally, got exactly what they deserved. I'll start at the beginning, the real beginning, because context matters with families like mine. I am the middle child of three. My older brother Dominic is 31. I am 27. My younger sister Priya is 24. Our parents, I'll call them Gerald and Marlene, have been married for 33 years. To everyone on the outside, they are the perfect couple. Gerald is charming, successful, the kind of man who makes friends at every party and remembers everyone's name. Marlene is elegant, devoted, the kind of mother who brings homemade cookies to every school event and volunteers on every committee. They go to church. They host dinner parties. Their house is beautiful. Their lawn is immaculate. Their family is a performance. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I did not always know this. For a very long time, I thought my family was normal. I thought the way they treated me was normal. When your whole world tells you that the water you're drowning in is just air, you believe them. You think the problem is your lungs. Here is how our family actually worked. Dominic, my older brother, was the golden child. Capital G, capital C. He was Gerald's son in every way that mattered to Gerald. Tall, athletic, confident, and completely comfortable taking up space that belonged to other people. Dominic could do no wrong. Ever. Literally. I once watched Dominic back the car into the neighbor's fence, and when the neighbor came over to complain, Gerald told him Dominic had been inside the house all afternoon. The neighbor knew it was a lie. Gerald knew the neighbor knew. Nobody said anything, and because Gerald had that kind of presence, the kind that makes other people doubt their own perception of reality. Dominic learned from the best. Priya, my younger sister, was the baby, also known as the fragile one, also known as the excuse. Priya had been, at various points in our childhood, sensitive, anxious, delicate, and not like other kids. None of this was ever formally diagnosed because our parents didn't believe in therapy. They believed in managing appearances. What Priya actually was, I now understand, was a child who had learned that performing weakness got her everything she needed. She cried, and the world stopped. She complained, and someone fixed it. She decided she didn't like something, and it disappeared from our lives. I love my sister. I want to say that clearly, because she is also a victim of our parents in her own way. But Priya learned to weaponize her fragility before she was old enough to know what a weapon was, and that made her dangerous in ways she probably still doesn't fully understand. And then, there was I. I was the scapegoat. If you're familiar with narcissistic family systems, you know exactly what that means. If you're not, let me explain. In a narcissistic family, the narcissistic parent, or parents, lucky me, I got two for the price of one, needs a child to be the source of all problems. The golden child confirms the parent's greatness. Look at this perfect child I raised. The scapegoat serves a different function. They are the reason anything goes wrong. They are the release valve for every frustration, every tension, every failure the family doesn't want to look at directly. Everything bad that happens in the family can be traced back to the scapegoat, because the alternative, looking at the actual source of dysfunction, is unthinkable. I was blamed for things that happened before I was born. I was blamed for Gerald's bad moods, Marlene's headaches, Dominic's poor grades, and Priya's crying fits. I was blamed for the time the oven broke. You must have done something to it. For the leak in the basement, probably left a window open. For the car getting a flat tire in the middle of winter on a road I had never been on. Well, if you hadn't asked to use the car last week, your father wouldn't have been driving it more and the tire wouldn't have worn down. The logic didn't have to make sense. It just had to land on me. I was also the family workhorse. By the time I was 10, I was doing most of the household cooking because Marlene had a lot on her plate. By 12, I was managing the grocery shopping and keeping track of everyone's schedules. By 15, I was doing the family's taxes with Gerald standing over my shoulder, taking credit. By 17, I had a part-time job and was expected to contribute a portion of my paycheck to household expenses, while Dominic's after-school job money was entirely his own because he needs to learn to save. College was my escape, or so I thought. I got into a university 4 hours away. Full scholarship. I had worked incredibly hard for it, partly out of genuine love of learning and partly because some deep animal part of me understood that education was the only ladder out of the hole I was living in. And my parents' reaction to my scholarship was instructive. Marlene cried, not happy tears. She stood in the kitchen holding my acceptance letter and cried in that specific way she had. Silent, sustained, designed to be witnessed. And when I asked what was wrong, she said, nothing, sweetheart. I'm just thinking about who's going to take care of everything when you're gone. Not, I'm so proud of you. Not, you worked so hard for this. Who's going to take care of everything? Gerald's response was to immediately begin discussing how I could use my scholarship money, there was a small living stipend attached, to help pay for Priya's upcoming school trip to Europe. When I pointed out that the stipend was meant for my living expenses, he looked at me the way he always looked at me when I said something that inconvenienced him, with this slow, disappointed blink, like I was a dog who'd just bitten him after years of patient training. I thought you'd be more generous, he said, especially given everything we've done for you. Everything they'd done for me. I thought about that a lot during the 4-hour drive to campus in August. University was the first time in my life I met people who, upon hearing me describe my family, did not say, "Oh, all families are like that," or, "You're probably being too hard on them." My roommate, a woman named Cassidy who has since become my best friend and was present for the events later in this story, listened to me talk about my childhood for about 40 minutes one night during our first week, and then said, very quietly, "That's not normal. What you're describing is not normal." I didn't believe her, but I started paying attention. I took a psychology elective in my second year. We covered family systems theory. I sat in that lecture hall and felt the blood drain out of my face as my professor described narcissistic family dynamics: the golden child, the scapegoat, the lost child, the mascot. And I thought, she's describing my house. She's describing my house, and she's never met my family. I went home for Christmas that year with new eyes, and what I saw with those new eyes broke something open in me that has never fully closed again. In the space of 5 days, I watched Dominic lie to my father's face about a minor fender bender and get a pat on the back. And "these things happen, son." I watched Priya fake a stomachache to get out of helping with Christmas dinner and be tucked up on the couch with hot tea and sympathetic murmurs. I watched my mother redistribute 3 of my Christmas presents to Priya, because Priya seemed disappointed with what Santa brought. Actual quote, said to my face, about presents from my extended family that had my name on the tags. I watched my father not notice, or pretend not to notice, which, by that point, I understood were the same thing. I went back to university in January and I cried for 3 days. And then I started building walls. Here's the thing about realizing your family is toxic: it doesn't automatically free you, especially when you still love them. Especially when you've been conditioned since birth to believe that keeping the peace is your job. Yes, especially when every attempt to assert yourself is met with such overwhelming force: tears, guilt, cold silence, the devastating implication that you are destroying this family, that you learn to pick your battles very, very carefully. For the next several years, I managed my family the way you manage a chronic illness: carefully, consistently, with a lot of energy expended on containment. I graduated with honors. My family attended my graduation ceremony. Marlene spent most of it talking to another mother about Dominic's upcoming promotion at the company he worked for. Gerald shook my hand when they handed me my diploma. Priya complained about the heat and asked twice when we were going to lunch. I got a job at a mid-sized marketing firm. I was good at my job. I am still good at my job. And I've since been promoted twice. And I found that the skills I developed as a family scapegoat were actually somewhat useful in a professional environment. I was extremely good at reading rooms. I was very practiced at staying calm under unreasonable pressure. I had an advanced degree in managing difficult personalities. I moved into an apartment. I made friends. I started therapy with a woman named Dr. Okonkwo, who was, and I say this with complete sincerity, the single most important person in my recovery, and who I will love for the rest of my life. And I maintained a relationship with my family because I didn't know how not to, and because I still, after everything, loved them. This was my mistake. Not because love is a mistake, but because I was giving love to people who were using it against me. Here is a partial list of things that happened during the managing years, roughly from age 22 to 26. When I got my first real apartment, my parents asked me to let Dominic store some of his things in my second bedroom temporarily. Temporarily lasted 14 months and included a futon, 3 bicycles, 2 industrial shelving units, and, at one point, Dominic himself for 6 weeks when he had a falling out with a roommate. He paid no rent. He used my groceries. He left dishes in the sink. When I asked him to leave, he told my parents I had abandoned him in his time of need, and Marlene called me crying to ask how I could be so cruel to my own brother. When I was 23, I was in a car accident. Not my fault. Someone ran a red light and hit the driver's side of my car. I was shaken, but physically fine. I called my mother from the side of the road. Her first question after, "Are you hurt?" was, "How bad is the car?" Her second was, "Your insurance is going to go up, isn't it?" Her third was to tell me that I needed to call the other driver's insurance directly because Gerald had had a bad experience with car claims going through his insurer once, and she didn't want the same thing to happen to me. She was still giving me advice about the insurance process when I realized I was standing on the side of a road in November, shaking, and what I needed was not insurance advice. I said, "Mom, I just need someone to talk to right now." She said, "Of course, sweetheart," and then told me about a claim situation Dominic had navigated well last year. I stood on that road for 2 more minutes and then hung up and called Cassidy. When I turned 25, my parents threw a party for Priya. Priya had just gotten a new job, which was genuinely exciting, and I was happy for her. But the party was on my birthday, the same day. And nobody mentioned that until I arrived and found a "Congratulations, Priya" banner across the living room. When I pointed out, carefully, privately, to my mother that it was also my birthday, she looked genuinely puzzled for a moment and then said, "Oh, we can do something for you next weekend." Next weekend came and went. Nothing happened. When I was 26, I started dating a man I'll call Marco. Marco was kind, funny, and emotionally intelligent in ways I found almost disorienting at first. He met my family at Christmas and afterwards, on the drive home, was very quiet. When I asked what he was thinking, he chose his words carefully and said, "I think your family is a lot." He then asked if I was okay. I said yes. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "You don't have to be okay with it, you know." I cried the entire rest of the way home, not because I was sad exactly, because nobody had ever said that to me before. Marco and I are still together. He is a large part of why I am alive and functioning today, and also a large part of what I'm about to tell you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I need to tell you about the money, because the money is central to what came later. My parents are not wealthy, but they are comfortable. Gerald works in commercial real estate. Marlene manages a boutique. They own their house outright. It was inherited from Marlene's parents. And they have retirement savings and investments. They are not struggling. For as long as I can remember, money in our family flowed in one direction, toward Dominic and Priya, and when necessary, out of me. Dominic had his college tuition paid in full. Priya had her college tuition paid in full, plus a monthly allowance, plus her car, plus her phone plan. I had a partial scholarship I had worked brutally hard to earn, and the rest I paid through a combination of work-study, a part-time job, and small loans that I spent years paying off. When Dominic wanted to start a business at 27, our parents gave him $40,000 in startup capital. The business failed within 18 months. Nobody spoke about it directly. Gerald mentioned once that these things happen, and that was that. When Priya wanted to move to a better apartment at 22, our parents co-signed her lease and covered her deposit and first month's rent. She moved into a place that cost more per month than my mortgage payment does now. When I was 24 and asked my parents if they could loan me $5,000, loan, not gift, to cover a gap while I was between jobs after being laid off during a company restructure, my father explained carefully that they were in a tight spot right now, and that he was sure I would figure it out. I figured it out. I always figured it out. I've been figuring it out my entire life. I want to tell you about the money thing now because I want you to have it in the back of your mind when I tell you what happened when I was 27. I was 27 when Marlene called me on a Tuesday afternoon to tell me that Gerald had had a heart attack. It was not a severe heart attack. He was stable. He was going to be fine. But it had been scary and sudden, and it required a period of recovery. I drove to my parents' house that evening. I sat with Marlene while she cried. I cooked dinner for everyone. I made sure Priya, who had arrived from her apartment, was okay. I called Dominic, who said he'd try to come up that weekend. Dominic arrived that Saturday. By that point, I had been essentially living at my parents' house, working remotely from their guest room, managing Gerald's follow-up appointments, filling his prescriptions, handling the insurance paperwork for his hospital stay, cooking, cleaning, and keeping Marlene steady through the fear that tends to follow a medical scare. Dominic arrived on Saturday, stayed for dinner, watched football with Gerald, and announced on Sunday morning that he had to get back. He had things to deal with. He hugged everyone, promised to call, and left. Marlene did not ask him to stay. Marlene did not thank me for having been there all week. What Marlene did on Monday morning, while I was making Gerald's breakfast and reviewing his discharge paperwork, was mention that now that Gerald was recovering, she and Gerald had been talking about the future. I said that was wise. She said they'd been thinking about how best to ensure the family was taken care of. I said that sounded good. She said they'd consulted with a financial planner and they'd also spoken with an estate attorney about updating the will. I said I thought that was very responsible. She said she wanted me to hear it from her directly rather than find out another way. They had decided to divide the estate unequally, with the larger portions going to Dominic and Priya, because Dominic has responsibilities. He'd recently had a child with his girlfriend, and because Priya is still finding her footing, she was 24 with a good job and an expensive apartment my parents were already helping fund, and because You've always been so capable and independent, and we know you don't really need it. I sat very still. I want you to understand the specific precision of this particular cruelty. It was using my survival against me. Every coping mechanism I'd developed, every time I'd stood up and figured it out without their help. Every bit of competence I had built out of sheer necessity. All of it was now being used as justification for why I deserved less. I had been punished for struggling, and I was now being punished for not struggling. The game had been rigged from the start. I said calmly, "How much less?" Marlene looked slightly uncomfortable. She said the specifics weren't finalized. I said, "Mom, how much less?" She said Dominic and Priya would each receive 40% of the estate. I would receive 20. I nodded. I finished making Gerald's breakfast. I brought it to him. I went to the guest room, packed my bag, said I had to get back to work, kissed Gerald on the forehead, hugged Marlene, got in my car, drove 20 minutes down the road, pulled into a gas station parking lot, and had the most complete emotional breakdown of my adult life. And I called Marco. I called Cassidy. I called Dr. Okonkwo and left a message asking for an emergency session. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, sitting in that gas station parking lot, I made a decision. I was done. Not dramatically, not with a screaming confrontation, not yet anyway. But something had clicked off inside me, some last remaining pilot light of hope that my family would eventually, someday, see me, really see me, and recognize what they'd done, and change. It had gone out. And with it went the part of me that kept managing, kept adjusting, kept making myself smaller to fit into the space they'd assigned me. I was done. Here's the thing I want to say to everyone who has ever been a scapegoat in a narcissistic family. When you stop managing the situation, when you stop smoothing things over and absorbing the blame and keeping the peace, the machinery of the family doesn't stop. It just looks for a new gear. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't send a dramatic text, write a letter, or call a family meeting. I simply became less available. I stopped answering the phone on the first ring. I stopped driving 4 hours at a moment's notice. I stopped volunteering to coordinate holidays. I said, "I can't make it this year at Thanksgiving for the first time in my life." The reaction was swift and illuminating. Marlene called me 7 times in the week after I missed Thanksgiving. The calls escalated in emotional temperature from "we missed you" to "is everything okay?" to "I don't understand what's happening" to "I've been crying all week" to "your behavior is affecting your father's recovery" to "I didn't raise you to abandon your family." I listened to all of these voicemails with Dr. Okonkwo, who helped me understand that what I was hearing was not grief. It was the sound of a control mechanism being activated. Dominic texted me twice. The first text said, "What's your deal?" The second text, sent 3 days later, said, "Mom is upset." Not, "How are you?" or "Is something wrong?" or "I heard about the will thing, that seems messed up." Just, "Mom is upset." As if his function in this situation, as in all situations, was merely to report Marlene's emotional state and expect me to fix it. Priya called me once, I crying, and said she didn't understand why I was doing this to the family. I asked her what I was doing. She said, "Pulling away, being cold, making everyone worry." I asked if she knew about the will. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "The estate stuff is complicated. There are reasons." And I said, "I know. I just wanted to know if you knew." She said she knew. I said, "Okay." We hung up. She knew. She had known, and she hadn't called me. She had waited to see if the machinery of the family would bring me back into line, and only when it didn't did she call. Not to say she was sorry, not to say it wasn't fair, but to ask me why I was upsetting everyone. I thought about that call a lot. During this period of pulling back, I was also quietly paying attention. Because I had started to suspect, based on things said over the years, and based on the financial patterns, based on what I'd observed, that there was more going on than I knew. And I was right. I'm going to call my aunt, Renata. Renata is my mother's sister, 5 years younger than Marlene, and she and my mother have what I would describe as a complicated relationship, which is what you say when two sisters have been in low-level competition for 30 years, and both pretend otherwise. Renata had always been warmer to me than Marlene. I think partly because she could see the dynamic in my family, even if she never named it. And she was the one who, over coffee, during a visit she made to my city, finally told me the things I hadn't known. Renata told me that when my maternal grandparents had died, the inheritance they left behind had been divided between Marlene and Renata. When she told me that Marlene's share had been significant, not life-changing wealthy, but genuinely substantial. And she told me that Marlene had spent a portion of it, over the years, on Dominic and Priya. I said, "Not on me?" Renata looked at her coffee cup. She said there had been discussions, years ago, about putting money aside for each of the grandchildren's educations. She said she believed that money had been put aside for all three of us. She said she didn't know what had happened to my portion. I sat with that for a very long time. I thought about my scholarship, my loans. My parents told me they were in a tight spot when I'd asked for a $5,000 loan at 24. The $40,000 they'd given Dominic's failed business. Priya's apartment deposit. I thought about the will, Miran and the explanation that I was capable and independent and didn't really need it. I went home and I called an estate attorney. Not to contest anything. At that point, there was nothing to contest. Gerald was alive, and the will was their business. But I had questions. I wanted to understand what I was dealing with. I wanted to know the landscape. The attorney I spoke with was professional, helpful, and asked me several questions that led me to understand something important. If there had been money set aside for me, in a trust, in a designated account, in any formal arrangement, I might have a right to information about it, particularly if I had been named as a beneficiary of something I hadn't been told about. I started asking very careful questions in very careful ways, to Renata. To my maternal grandmother's former accountant, who was retired but remembered my grandmother fondly and was willing to have a conversation. To a cousin on my mother's side who was 6 years older than me and had been present for family financial discussions I had been excluded from as a child. It took me 4 months. 4 months of patient, careful, document-supported inquiry. And here is what I found. When my maternal grandparents died, they had left each grandchild a small educational trust. Not enormous. We're talking roughly $22,000 per grandchild, set up to be released at age 21 for educational or vocational expenses. Dominic's trust had been released at 21. Priya's trust had been released at 21. Mine had been released at 21 as well. To Marlene. On a form that listed her as the trustee with authority to disburse the funds for the beneficiary's educational or vocational needs at her discretion, and on which, apparently, she had at some point redirected the funds. To where? I could not immediately determine. That required another kind of inquiry. But I knew enough. I knew enough to know that the story I had been told, that I was capable and independent and didn't need support, was not a description of my character. It was a description of a theft they had committed and were hoping I would never investigate. Here is what I did not do. I did not call my mother screaming. I did not send a dramatic email. I did not show up at their house. I did not tell Dominic or Priya what I had found. I did not post anything on social media. I did not vent to mutual family friends. I did not do any of the things that would have given my family the ability to frame me as hysterical, vindictive, or unstable. I had spent 27 years being the emotional one, the dramatic one, the one who made everything about herself. I was not going to give them that story again. Instead, I called my attorney back, and I told her what I had found, and she told me what my options were. And then I called Marco, and I told him everything. The whole thing. From the trust to the will to the years of it. The whole accumulated weight of being the person my family had decided I was. He listened for a very long time. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What do you want?" Not, "What are you going to do?" "What do you want?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. In the way that Dr. Okonkwo had been teaching me to think about things. Not what I should want, not what would seem proportionate or measured or forgiving. What did I actually want? I wanted the money. I wanted what had been taken from me. I wanted them to know that I knew. I wanted there to be consequences. And, this was the hardest one to admit, I wanted my family to have to look at what they had done. Not to apologize to me. I had stopped expecting apologies years ago, but I wanted them not to be able to pretend anymore. I wanted the performance to crack. I wanted people to see what was behind the beautiful lawn, the church attendance, and the dinner parties. I wanted the curtain pulled back. So I made a plan. Step 1 was the legal piece. My attorney had established, through documentation, that the trust money designated for my educational benefit had been redirected by Marlene. The question of whether this constituted an actionable misappropriation of trust funds depended on the specific language of the trust documents and the degree to which Marlene's discretion as trustee covered what she had actually done. The trust documents, as obtained through my grandmother's estate records, specified that the funds could be disbursed for educational, vocational, or developmental expenses for the named beneficiary. They did not specify that the trustee could redirect the funds to other family members or use them to subsidize other children's expenses or any other such disbursement that would effectively strip the beneficiary of the intended inheritance. My attorney, after reviewing everything, told me that I had a reasonable civil case, not a certainty. These things are never certainties, but a reasonable case, and one that might be resolved without full litigation if the opposing party were motivated to avoid a legal process. People who have done something wrong, my attorney explained with the calm professionalism of someone who has seen everything, are often very motivated to avoid a legal process. Step 2 was the documentation. I spent 3 weeks creating a comprehensive, organized, evidence-supported record of the trust and its terms, the disbursement to Marlene, the subsequent expenses I had incurred for my own education that the trust should have covered, the financial support given to Dominic and Priya from my parents, and the timeline of it all. My attorney reviewed it. My accountant reviewed it. Cassidy, who works in finance and has an eye for patterns, reviewed it. It was airtight, or close enough to airtight that it would be deeply unpleasant to fight. Step 3 was the timing. My parents had a 30th wedding anniversary party planned, a big one. Marlene had been planning it for 2 years. They were renewing their vows. There would be 70-plus guests, including Marlene's siblings, including Renata, extended family, their church friends, Gerald's work colleagues, and their neighborhood friends. Everyone who mattered to them. Everyone who made up the audience for the performance. I want to be very clear. I did not plan to make a scene at the party. I did not plan to stand up during the vow renewal and announce what they had done. I am not interested in public humiliation as a tactic. It's messy, it hurts bystanders, and it makes the person doing it look unstable. None of those things served my goals. What I did plan was the timing of the letter. My attorney prepared a formal demand letter. Civil, professional, absolutely devastating in its specificity. It outlined what had happened with the trust, what our legal position was, and what we were asking for. The value of the misappropriated funds, adjusted for the interest it would have accrued, and reimbursement for a portion of the educational loans I had taken out that the trust should have covered. The total was not enormous, call it $28,000, but the letter was not really about the money. The letter was about the knowledge. The letter was about forcing them to sit with the awareness that I knew, that other people knew, and that this was no longer the family's quiet secret. The letter arrived at my parents' house on a Thursday. The anniversary party was on Saturday. I was not at the party. I had been invited. Of course I had been invited. I was their daughter. My absence would have required explanation. But I had sent my regrets 2 weeks earlier, citing a work commitment. Marlene had pushed back, then guilt-tripped, then gone cold and brief. I had maintained my position with polite firmness. I would not be there. I was sorry. Cassidy, however, was there, not in any conspiratorial capacity. Cassidy had met my parents a handful of times over the years and had been invited separately, as she'd become friendly with some of the same people through a community connection. Her attendance was genuinely coincidental, or close enough to it that I hadn't asked her not to go. Cassidy texted me throughout the evening with the kind of precise, almost journalistic detail that makes her invaluable in a crisis. Here is what happened, as reconstructed from her texts and from what I later learned from Renata. Gerald and Marlene received the letter on Thursday. Gerald read it first. According to Renata, who got this from her own sources within the family, Gerald's reaction was to go very quiet and then have a conversation with Marlene behind the closed door of their bedroom that lasted approximately 2 hours and was audible, at points, from the hallway. Dominic was called. He came over on Friday. There was another long, partially audible conversation. Dominic apparently expressed the view that this was completely out of nowhere and obviously some kind of misunderstanding, which is a very specific kind of willful blindness that I think tells you everything you need to know about Dominic. Priya was told on Friday evening. According to Renata, Priya's reaction was to cry, which is Priya's reaction to everything. Nobody called me. The party on Saturday was, by all accounts, visibly off. Marlene was performing at approximately 70% of her normal capacity. She was there, she was smiling, she was greeting guests, but something was wrong in a way that people who knew her well could sense. Gerald was drinking more than usual. Dominic, who had brought his girlfriend and their baby, was stiff and distracted. Renata noticed immediately. She found Marlene in the kitchen at one point and asked directly if everything was okay. Marlene said yes, of course. Everything was wonderful. Renata, who has known my mother for 50 years and can read her like a headline, said it was not convincing. The vow renewal happened. There were speeches. Gerald gave a speech about love and family and the life they had built together, and Cassidy told me later it was one of the most uncomfortable speeches she had ever witnessed because he kept losing his place and looking slightly greenish. What broke the surface? What turned the evening from slightly off to actively derailing was the toast. Gerald's business partner, a man I'll call Frank, who is approximately Gerald's age and has known the family for 15 years, gave a toast. It was a warm, funny, entirely well-intentioned toast, and in the middle of it, Frank said something like, "The two of you have raised 3 remarkable children, and anyone can see how proud you should be." 3 remarkable children. Marlene began to cry, which was not unusual. She cried at sentimental moments. But these were not the right kind of tears. They were too abrupt, too ragged, with a quality of something guilt-shaped beneath them. And Renata, who was standing near enough to observe, later told me that she watched Gerald and Marlene exchange a look in that moment that she recognized. She said she had seen that look before, in families she had known, when a secret was pulling too hard at the seams. She didn't know what it meant yet. She found out later. After the party, after the guests had left and the family, Gerald, Marlene, Dominic, Priya, and Renata, who was staying the weekend, were sitting in the living room with the remnants of the evening. Renata said that Priya was the one who broke first. Priya, who had been crying on and off all evening. Priya, who had been looking at her mother with an expression that Renata described as something between guilt and accusation. Priya, who, in a moment that I believe she probably immediately regretted, looked at Marlene and said, "Did you talk to her? Did anyone talk to her?" Marlene said, "Not tonight, Priya." Renata said, "Talk to who?" Dominic said, "It's not the time." Renata said, "Talk to who?" And Priya, still crying, said my name. What followed was, by Renata's account, one of the most unpleasant conversations she had ever been present for. Because once Renata understood the shape of what had happened, the trust, and the money, the letter, the years of it, she was not quiet about her reaction. Renata is not, by nature, a quiet woman, and she had loved my grandmother. She had been present for my grandmother setting up those trusts. She had, she told me later, believed all these years that I had received mine. The argument that happened in that living room on the night of Gerald and Marlene's 30th anniversary, with the flowers still on the table and the champagne glasses not yet cleaned up, was something I was not present for, but have heard described multiple times from multiple angles. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, so I'll tell you only the outcome. Renata left that night. She drove to a hotel. She called me on Sunday morning. She said, "I need to tell you that I'm sorry. I should have paid more attention. I should have known something was wrong." I said, "You couldn't have known." She said, "I want you to know that I believe you and I'm on your side. And if your attorney needs a witness to the intentions of those trusts, I was there when your grandmother set them up. I know exactly what she intended." I had to put the phone down for a minute. The letter had given my parents 30 days to respond. They called me 3 days after the party. Both of them, together, on the speaker. It was the most surreal phone call of my life. My parents, who had never once in my memory sat down to have an honest conversation with me about anything real, calling me together, on speaker, to discuss the fact that they had been legally notified of an actionable misappropriation of funds designated for their daughter's benefit. Gerald spoke first. He said there had been a miscommunication. He said the funds had been used for family expenses that benefited all of us. He said he and Marlene had always intended to make it right and simply hadn't gotten around to formalizing that intention. I let him finish. I said, "I have an attorney. All further communication about this matter should go through her." Marlene said, "This is our family." I said, "I know." She said, "You're going to destroy this family." I said, "I didn't build the thing that's falling apart, Mom." There was a long silence. I said, "I have to go. My attorney's contact information is in the letter. Please have your attorney reach out to her." I hung up. I then sat on my kitchen floor for about 10 minutes with my back against the cabinet, just breathing. Marco sat down next to me. He didn't say anything. He just sat there. That was exactly right. What followed was a negotiation that I will not walk through in excruciating detail because it was handled primarily by attorneys and was, frankly, less narratively satisfying than everything that came before it. Here are the key points. My parents, upon consulting their own attorney, apparently received advice similar to what I had expected. This was not a good case for them to take to court. The documentation was thorough. Renata's potential testimony about my grandmother's intentions was significant. The paper trail was unpleasant. They settled. Not everything I had asked for. This is how settlements work, but substantially most of it. I received a sum that covered the bulk of the misappropriated trust value and a portion of the educational loan costs. Total, $24,000. To some people, that might sound like a small number for this amount of story. I want to address that directly. It was not about the number. $24,000 is nothing. It made a real difference to my financial situation, but the financial outcome was genuinely secondary to the other outcomes, which were Renata knew. Renata, who is embedded in the same social and family network as my parents, who attends the same extended family gatherings, who is positioned to see and remember what had happened, now knew. My parents' attorney, who had presumably had to review the full documentation to advise them, now knew. Dominic and Priya, who had watched the settlement happen, who had been present for the conversation at the anniversary party, who had presumably been consulted during the process. They now knew in a way they could not unknow, could not dismiss as drama or her being sensitive again. The story had gotten out of the box my parents had kept it in. That was worth more than the money. I am going to tell you about the fallout in sections, because it happened in waves. Dominic's initial position was that I had gone nuclear over a misunderstanding and had weaponized lawyers against our parents. He sent me a text that I still have, that I have read many times, that read, "I hope you're proud of yourself. You always needed to be the victim." I did not respond. Dominic's position shifted over the following months, as the reality of what had happened settled in, and as he apparently had several conversations with his girlfriend, who, according to Priya, did not react well to learning about the trust situation. Dominic's girlfriend is apparently a practical and straightforward woman who, upon understanding what had occurred, expressed the view that if my parents had done this to me, they might be capable of other things. And what exactly had they given Dominic, and where had that money come from? I don't know the specifics of what happened in their relationship as a result. I know that Dominic became noticeably less enthusiastic in his public support of my parents in the months following. He has not apologized to me. I am not holding my breath. But he also has not, since that text, contacted me to tell me I am the villain. I count this as progress. Priya is more complicated. I told you I love my sister. And I meant it. And I think what has happened with Priya is genuinely the most painful part of this whole story. Priya called me approximately 6 weeks after the settlement. She had clearly been building up to the call for a while. She was very stilted and formal in a way that means she rehearsed. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known about the trust. I believe this is true. And that finding out had been really hard. She said she wished things had been different. I said I appreciated her saying that. She then said, and this is where it got complicated, that she hoped I understood the position she was in. She said that she was still close with our parents and that she didn't want to be put in the middle. She said she cared about me, but she also cared about them, and she needed to find a way to navigate that. I said I understood. I did not say, "You have always been in the middle, Priya. You were put in the middle from birth." The difference is that now the middle is not comfortable for you, and that discomfort is the first honest thing this family has produced in 30 years. I did not say that, but I thought it. Priya and I are in contact. It is cautious, careful contact. We text sometimes. We have had coffee twice. I am not the same person with her that I was. I am watching carefully to see what she does with what she now knows. Whether she uses it to grow, or whether she finds a way to fold it back into the comfortable story of our family that she has been living inside for her entire life. Time will tell. My parents sent me a card. Not a letter. A card. A generic thinking of you card with their signatures inside, and a short note in Marlene's handwriting that said they hoped I was well, and that the door is always open. The door is always open. I keep the card in a drawer. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because the fact that this is the best they can do, after everything, is its own kind of documentation. The thinnest possible version of an olive branch, extended in the hope that I would come back and resume my previous function in the family, without the inconvenience of anyone having to say they were sorry or change anything about the way they operated. I have not walked through the open door. I think about it sometimes. Not because I miss the family I actually had, but because I grieve, still, the family I wanted them to be. The family I kept trying to see them as for 27 years. That family doesn't exist and never did. And grief is not logical. And the fact that I can feel sad about the loss of something imaginary doesn't mean the imaginary thing was real. Doctor. Okonkwo says that's a healthy thought. I'm trusting her on that one. I am 27 years old. I am sitting at my kitchen table, which is in an apartment that is mine. Completely, solely mine. No borrowed furniture from Dominic. No sense of obligation hovering in the air. Marco is in the next room. I can hear him on a call. We have talked about the future in ways that feel real and grounded and like something we are building together, rather than something I am performing for an audience. I am 2 years into therapy with Dr. Okonkwo, who I plan to keep seeing for as long as she'll have me. I am learning, slowly, what it feels like to live a life that is not organized around managing other people's perception of me. It is disorienting in ways I did not expect. I still flinch sometimes. I still catch myself apologizing for things that don't require an apology. I still feel, sometimes, the ghost of the person I used to be. The one who would have taken that phone call from her mother and spent 2 days afterwards replaying it, looking for the place where she had gone wrong. But that person is not who I am anymore. Cassidy is coming for dinner on Friday. Renata sends me texts sometimes. Little things, articles she thinks I'd like, pictures of her dog, updates on the family that I can take or leave. She came to visit last month, and we went to a farmer's market, got coffee, and talked for 4 hours about everything except my parents. And it was one of the best afternoons I've had in years. The $24,000 is in a savings account. I don't think I'll touch it for a long time. Ma, and I'm not sure what I'll do with it eventually. Part of me wants to use it for something that would have horrified Gerald. Something creative, something impractical, something entirely for myself. My grandmother set up that trust for me because she wanted something good for my life. I think about that. I think about the fact that she saw me, even if my parents didn't. That she decided, deliberately, intentionally, to make sure I had something. That she believed I was worth the effort. She was right. It took me 27 years to believe it, but she was right. I've been going back and forth about how to end this post because it's a long one, and I feel like it deserves a real ending and not just a fade out. So, here's what I want to say. If you're reading this and you recognize your family in this story, if you're the one who does everything and gets blamed for everything and has spent years believing that the problem is you, I want to tell you what nobody told me until Cassidy said it in a dorm room when I was 19. What you're describing is not normal, and it is not your fault. And the fact that they made you capable enough to survive it is not a justification for the fact that they made you survive it alone. You don't have to burn the house down. You don't have to send a letter or hire an attorney or do any specific thing. But you are allowed to stop managing. You are allowed to stop being the absorber, the fixer, the apologizer. You are allowed to take up the space they spent years telling you was too much. The door, they said, was always open. You're allowed to decide you have somewhere better to be. I did. And I do.